I'm really sorry. I think that we were facing some technical issues. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon and good evening wherever you are. On behalf of the Islamabad Policy Institute, I formally welcome you all in today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is South Asia and Biden Administration Engagement and Challenges. Today's event is taking place to understand the new US administration's policies towards South Asia. With this brief introduction, I would request Executive Director of Islamabad Policy Institute, Professor C. Sajjad Bukhari, to deliver his welcome and introductory remarks. Professor C. Sajjad Bukhari is the founder of Islamabad Policy Institute. He is currently heading IPI as its Executive Director. Over to you, sir.
Professor Daniel Marty, Ambassador Javed Hussain, friends and colleagues. I wish to welcome all of you to another webinar hosted by Islamabad Policy Institute on a very important issue that would greatly influence the development in our region. We are gathered here today to exchange ideas on an important topic, as President Biden's election has raised some hopes that he will strike a balance in US foreign policy by reverting to multilateralism and end US isolationism. It is widely believed that President Biden will try to rehabilitate US fractured ties with its allies and partners. He vowed to restore JCPOA with Iran and rejoin WHO and the climate accord. But the foremost priorities after assuming office will be the domestic issues like COVID-19, economic recovery, racial divide, and internal cohesion. On the external front, issues relevant to South Asia and Pakistan are the forthcoming decisions on Afghan peace process and the withdrawal of US troops. While many expect Biden administration to adhere to the understanding reached with Taliban during the Trump era, Afghanistan faces many uncertainties, including a power vacuum and a civil war. Meanwhile, trajectory of US-India relations and the outlook towards China will directly affect Pakistan and consequently Pakistan-US relations. There can be tough talk and retaliatory measures, but Biden's administration may seek accommodation with China. For instance, on trade, health, and climate change issues. A more realistic policy, given the inseparable nature of US-China economic ties, will influence Biden's policy, but a strategic reversal is unlikely. In South Asia, the Democrats' approach to project India as a counterweight to China and a regional policeman may be pursued with greater consistency and coherence, notwithstanding Biden's reservations on on India's policy with regard to its treatment of religious minorities and human rights violation in the Indian held Kashmir. There is now a firm strategic convergence between India and US against China, which will play out in our region to the detriment of both Pakistan and China. Pakistan will have to navigate its diplomacy skillfully in this crossfire. There is a broad agreement amongst South Asia watchers that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden hold similar views on South Asia. Both support a strong relationship with India as a key partner to help push back against Beijing's presence in the Indo-Pacific. Quadrilateral security dialogue arrangement will get more prominence along with the proposed coalition of democracies. We may see increased militarization and increased competitions by rival navies in the Indian Ocean, thus endangering the security of this region and beyond. The strategic environment puts considerable strain on Pakistan-US relations. The challenge for policymakers in Islamabad and Washington is to search for common ground while handling differences carefully through diplomatic channels. Pakistan should make effort to go beyond the historic transactional nature of the relationship. Similarly, the US needs to broaden its perspective beyond the Afghan lens. Pakistan's focus needs to be on expanding trade and inviting more American investments to the country. Above all, both sides should be invested in exploring opportunities that may build mutual trust and undertake pragmatic cooperation for peaceful and prosperous South Asia. It is for this purpose that we now turn to our esteemed panelists for insight analysis and actionable recommendation for policy makers in Pakistan and the US. I thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I would like to introduce our moderator and speaker for today's event. Mr. Bakar Sajjad Sayed, our moderator for today's webinar, is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent for Dawn. Our next worthy speaker who has joined us from the United States is Professor Daniel S. Markey. Daniel Markey is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He also serves as the academic director of the Johns Hopkins Global Policy Program. I welcome him to our today's event. Our second speaker for today's webinar is His Excellency Ambassador Retired Javed Hussain. Ambassador Hussain is a career diplomat from the Foreign Services of Pakistan. He has had a distinguished career during which he served as the Ambassador of Pakistan to the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and Iran. With this very brief introduction, I would like to hand over the session to our moderator, Mr. Bakar Sajjad. Over to you.
Thank you, Mubin. I wish to thank friends at Islamabad Policy Institute for inviting me to moderate this session. It is indeed an honor for me to be part of this discussion on Pakistan-United States ties with such an eminent panel. Mubin has already made the introductions, although our panelists for today's discussion didn't need that. According to the plan that has been given to me by the organizers, the two panelists will first present their brief remarks or opening comments about this topic before we then go into the discussion part. Therefore, I would first like to invite Professor Daniel Markey. Professor, as you explained to us Biden administration's policy vis-a-vis Pakistan and South Asia, I hope you could also address the perception that Pakistan is not a priority in Washington now. President Biden understands this region and Pakistan well. Can we assume that the events during President Biden's tenure as the vice president are influencing his approach towards Pakistan, or is he being dictated by the geopolitical realities? At least we in Islamabad, as Professor Bukhari also mentioned, it looks to us that President Biden's policy towards South Asia is just a continuation of that of his predecessor, although everyone was expecting a large-scale reset of the foreign policy.
Great. Thanks so much, first of all, for the invitation to speak today. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with Ambassador Hussain, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that follows. I also wanted to say that Professor Bokhari, his opening remarks are awfully similar to what I had planned to say, and I will stick with it, but I think you'll hear a fair amount of resonance because these are the issues that certainly I'm thinking about, and I imagine others within the Biden administration are thinking about. But to answer the question that was just raised at the outset, I do think that the Biden administration, in its specific thinking on Pakistan, is populated, the administration is populated by people who reflexively think back to the period when they were last in office, because virtually all of them served in the Obama administration, from the vice president or the former vice president, now president, on down. And so their views on Pakistan are naturally tinged by that experience and informed by it. But I think that, and I can also say that in conversations with individuals who have been a part of the Biden campaign team over the past couple of years, to bluntly answer your question, Pakistan was not central, is not central to the formulation of US policy in South Asia. However, that could change, and I think it may well change. And I think that it's important to appreciate here in the United States that you know, the world has moved on in the past 4 years. A lot has happened without us, in a sense, or despite us. And for the Biden administration, there's still some learning to do about what they missed and how the world has changed while they were out of office. And I think that a lot of that will be frustrating and creates new challenges, but some of it also opens the door to opportunities, including with Pakistan. And I think that's something for us to think about. But let me talk about where I think the Biden administration really is focusing its agenda for South Asia. It's being driven, and again, here is where the resonance with Professor Bokhari's earlier remarks will be clear. It's driven by two pillars. On the one hand, Afghanistan, and on the other hand, China. And in a sense, neither of these, you could say Afghanistan is a part of South Asia, but it's at its border, and China is very clearly not in South Asia. So the drivers for US policy are external to South Asia, and yet they are I think the two things that will be most likely to inform how the United States builds its policy in the region. So for Afghanistan, we now know from leaked documents that the Biden administration has a plan to, it appears, to attempt to accelerate the dialogue that has been ongoing with the Afghan Taliban. but not just to accelerate the Taliban government dialogue, although there is some effort at that, and to host a new round of talks in Turkey, but also to intensify the pressure for progress at a very late stage in the game, just months before the United States is sort of supposed to be leaving, withdrawing all of its forces out of Afghanistan by May. The idea is to bring together a multi-country team, presumably under UN auspices, to include Russia and China and India, Iran, the United States, Pakistan, of course, to try to encourage an inclusive governing body in Afghanistan, and to promote a ceasefire in the near term, all with the hope that by placing great external pressure on the parties in Afghanistan, including the Taliban and the government in Kabul, we can see some acceleration of progress toward a new framework for agreement between the warring parties, and that it will enable the United States to stick to a timeline for military withdrawal that looks similar to, if not identical to, what was already negotiated. Now, this has been described in the US press as a so-called Hail Mary pass. That is, in American football, the idea that you're going to toss the ball down the field and hope somebody catches it. It's something you do at the very end of a game when you have very little chance of winning. And I think this is a reasonable characterization, because this Biden plan is driven principally by a recognition of, I'll say it bluntly, of failure, of policy failure in Afghanistan over 2 decades, that now is plainly recognized by US officials. I think the recognition of that failure was made in some ways more possible by the Trump administration, that repeatedly, though it tried a variety of different tactics, never actually believed that this war in Afghanistan was winnable, and attempted to jumpstart diplomacy to that end. And it is carried on by now President Biden, who, while he was vice president, was pretty deeply skeptical about US policies pursued under the Obama administration. So now there is no appetite for another round of American military investment, or having another administration see its 4 years go by, all the while engaged in war in Afghanistan. No, I think the Biden administration is clearly committed to leaving, but wants to do so, and this is where this latest initiative comes in, wants to do so in a context that at least avoids a rapid deterioration of security on the ground, a rapid return to what might be described as full civil war, and with some kind of regional compact in place that will enable at least a degree of stability, or at least management of instability going forward. So that's what the goal is for Afghanistan. Now, shifting gears to China. I actually should have spoken about China first, because China, I think, is what I would describe as the organizing principle of Biden administration foreign policy. If you think about how the Biden administration sees the world, it begins in a way not so dissimilar from the Trump administration. It begins with global competition with China. And this is a change, because if we think back to the Obama administration, that is not the way the US-China relationship was at least officially characterized. But this change reflects a change in ground realities in the world, a change in China's own policies, and a change in the consensus in Washington, D.C. that now perceives China as very clearly the global competitor to the United States, and likely to remain so for a long period of time to come. And therefore, all of what the United States does internationally will be structured with China in mind, and in some ways with China or competition with China as its purpose. But the continuity with the Trump administration basically ends there, because whereas the Trump administration was famously America first, the Biden administration will take almost the opposite approach, in a sense of looking first to allies and partners, to shoring up traditional alliances and building out new partnerships. On the traditional alliances, of course, you'll see Secretary of State Blinken traveling out to Asia, meeting with treaty allies in Japan and elsewhere. On partnerships, you see that one of the earliest acts and focal points of President Biden is a discussion with Quad partners, the so-called Quad in Asia, to include India, but also Australia and Japan. And so alliances and partnerships are the building blocks for the Biden administration to contemplate and prosecute a global competition with China, as compared to the Trump administration, which denigrated our alliances. The Biden administration will build them up. That's the first part. The other piece that's pretty much upside down from the Trump administration is a focus on human rights and democracy. And here, the Biden administration has been quick and forthright from the top, including the Secretary of State, to go after China's policies, particularly in Xinjiang, with respect to its Uyghur population, and to characterize Chinese policies straightforwardly as genocide, and to do so repeatedly, which is something that at least President Trump was repeatedly unwilling to do. And by and large, President Trump was not a defender of democratic practices, principles, or human rights globally. And I think the Biden administration wants to draw a very clear line and distinction in its policies from what came before. Okay, so that's the organizing principle, that is China, and that will affect everything the United States does internationally, from multilateral agreements to dealing with regional contingencies. But here now, I think we do need to talk about the consequences of all of this for the US-Pakistan relationship. And I'll just leave you with two questions rather than answers, and we can take the conversation from here. But the first question is, what will be the relative near-term outcome in Afghanistan? And what will be the nature of the cooperation between the United States and Pakistan that comes out of that? I can imagine three scenarios in broad terms. A worst case scenario is that the long period of failure in Afghanistan is punctuated by a more serious failure over the next several months. That the security situation deteriorates, that the diplomacy leads nowhere, that the United States withdraws or nearly withdraws its military from Afghanistan in a context of mutual recriminations that leave the United States casting blame on regional players, including Pakistan, and regional players looking at the United States as an irresponsible superpower, leaving Afghanistan a mess for them to clean up. I can think of a marginally better scenario in which we are all engaged in a longer-term project of managing instability in Afghanistan. That security may deteriorate still further, that there is no clear framework for building Afghanistan under, say, a new constitution. And yet, all of the parties outside Afghanistan remain somewhat committed to managing at least the worst consequences of that instability, including refugee flows, including international terrorism, attempting to create pockets of stability within Afghanistan, even as other parts of Afghanistan deteriorate further. And then I can think of a best case scenario, that is managing stability. That is the next several months of accelerated dialogue and diplomacy, create a framework that is something that can be defended and built upon over months and years to come, and bring opportunities for broader cooperation between the United States and Pakistan going forward, not just on narrow issues of counterterrorism, but on broader issues of regional development, of infrastructure, of investment, and so on. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is, where does the United States-Pakistan relationship go in the context of this US-China global competition? Here too, a worst case scenario. The United States and Pakistan continue along a trajectory that is making them increasingly distant from one another. Pakistan becomes, from an American perspective, little more than a Chinese proxy, a tool or a projection of Chinese power and influence to the Arabian Sea. And South Asia becomes characterized by violent, increasingly violent bloc politics between, on the one hand, a China-Pakistan bloc, and on the other, an India-US bloc. That is a scenario that is potential, but not good for any of the players involved. A better scenario is Pakistan maintains some balance in its relations with China and the United States, at least working ties with the United States, even as it more clearly becomes a part, as so many other countries in continental Eurasia will, it becomes a part of an expanded area of Chinese economic and political influence. And then I can think of a best case scenario in which Pakistan uses its relations relations with China, including the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to encourage and build ties and opportunities with other states around the world and elsewhere, to use Chinese investments as a springboard to encourage outside investors and Pakistani investors, businesses, and also to encourage a continued closeness of cooperation at a bilateral level with the United States, and to promote that kind of cooperation into the future. So again, I leave you with more questions than answers, and I look forward to our conversation, but let me again thank you for including me on this panel, and I look forward to hearing from Ambassador Hussain.
Thank you, Marke, and for your very candid comments, and I think that were very helpful in understanding Biden's approach towards Pakistan. And our second panelist today is Ambassador Javed Hussain. Ambassador, now that I request you to tell us what could be Pakistan realistically expecting from President Biden and his team as they firm up their approach towards this region, I would like to put to you the same question that I put to Professor Marke, though phrased in a different way. How can Pakistan restore its salience for the US administration? And secondly, are there any Pakistani friends in Biden administration, or does Pakistan have any political capital on the Capitol Hill?
Thank you very much for inviting me to present my ideas and my views on this very important subject, which is confronting Pakistan's policymakers. And of course, some of the things that I'm going to say would again be a repetition of the views expressed by Professor Bukhari and Professor Marke. But I would also try to answer the question that you have just posed for me. I think perhaps, and this point has been made earlier, but I would like to emphasize it further, that in the coming years and decades, including Biden administration especially, the central issue which will determine US policies towards the rest of the world, especially South Asia, will be its growing rivalry with China. Now, I think this issue is not going to go away, and it is not a recent issue. America's or US policy of growing strategic partnership with India in response to its viewing China as its main rival has been sustained and continued for the last 4 by the last 4 American administrations, starting with Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And as Professor Markey pointed out, but the Biden administration also views China as its main rival, its main competitor, its main challenger on the global level. I think this is the central issue which will determine its policies towards global issues of peace and security, and also towards South Asia. And we are all aware that to contain China, America has adopted a number of policies, and those policies will continue. One of them is, which affects Pakistan directly, is US policy of building up India as a counterweight to China to check the expansion of its power and influence in South Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. And it has also been decided by the Biden administration, as confirmed by statements issuing from Washington, and also the conversation that President Biden had with Prime Minister Modi, that India would be given a central role in its Indo-Pacific region policy. This, besides other things, would also involve the building up of Quad alliance, to which Professor Markey has also referred. So I think what we are seeing now is a scenario which, for the policymakers in Islamabad, is quite a matter of serious concern. Because what you see is, in practical terms, that there is a growing strategic convergence between US and India. There is a growing strategic divergence between Pakistan and US. And also there is growing strategic partnership between Pakistan and China. Now this is a scenario in which policymakers in Washington and in Islamabad have to navigate with a view to ensuring that whatever this issue of strategic divergence is dealt with in a manner in which no irreparable damage is caused to Pakistan-US relations. At the same time, there are areas of convergence of interest between Pakistan and US, like trade and investment, and issues of peace and security, like restoration of durable peace in Afghanistan. And I would say even Pakistan could play a helpful role in the restoration of, or the maintenance of durable peace and security in the Persian Gulf region. After all, Pakistan, despite its weaknesses on the economic side, is a large country of 220 million, as is a nuclear power with considerable military strength, and it has a very strategic location. So even the policymakers in Washington, despite the growing strategic convergence with India, cannot ignore Pakistan's role in, especially in issues of peace and security, as they're finding in the case of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a prime example where Pakistan and US can work together, because it is in the interest of both of the countries, both Pakistan and US, that there is that following US military withdrawal from Afghanistan, that there is durable peace and stability. Although this will not be easy, as Professor Markey has very emphatically or clearly pointed out, there are very grave risks to stability and peace in Afghanistan in the coming months and years. And Pakistan and US will have to work very closely together if they genuinely want to avoid the increased conflicts, increased fighting, almost amounting to civil war in Afghanistan after US withdraws militarily from Afghanistan. And maybe the recent initiative by the Biden administration on the Afghanistan issue is perhaps an effort in that direction, because it has launched an initiative, maybe a little too late, because there's not much time before the agreed earlier, agreed date of withdrawal of U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan of 1st May. Of course, that agreement is being reviewed by the Biden administration, and it could reach a different policy conclusion. But nevertheless, there is not much time, and therefore there is an urgency on the part of both Pakistan and US in working together, and also urgency on the part of other major powers like China, Russia, and also regional countries, especially Iran, to work together to make their own contribution to ensure that following US military withdrawal from Afghanistan, there is no renewed conflict or increased conflict in Afghanistan. In fact, ideally one would hope and one would like that fighting in Afghanistan comes to an end, and there is a government, an inclusive government as suggested by the Biden administration, which basically means a government having Taliban elements and also some other political elements in it, so that it enjoys greater political support in Afghanistan, and also some kind of agreement on future constitutional arrangements in Afghanistan. If those targets can be achieved, then there is some hope that Afghanistan, now 4 decades of fighting, some peace and stability. If these efforts do not succeed, and I would be very candid in expressing my fears that, considering the background, the historical background of whatever has happened in Afghanistan, it will not be an easy task for the parties in Afghanistan to reach a political settlement. So the danger of a renewed or more intensified conflict in Afghanistan is there, and that further strengthens the point made by me earlier that Pakistan and US need to work very closely together for the restoration of durable peace and stability in Afghanistan. Coming back to China, I think US needs to take, of course, we understand that they view the American policymakers under Biden administration view China as their main rival, and that has repercussions for their policies for India and Japan and Australia and Indo-Pacific region and all that. But they should also look at the need for peace and stability in South Asia region. If they expect if they expect Pakistan to be cooperating with them on issues of peace and security in Afghanistan, and possibly later, at a later stage, even in the Persian Gulf region, or in the Indian Ocean, they need to keep in mind also Pakistan's concerns. Their strategic convergence or between Pakistan, between India and US should not take such an intensified form as to upset strategic balance in South Asia between Pakistan and India. Now that is a consideration which I hope the Biden administration would keep in mind, that whilst they have within their rights to strengthen their relationships and cooperation with India, they should do it in a way in which strategic balance India is not upset. Because if Pakistan's sensitivities are not kept in mind by the Biden administration, Pakistan will have no choice but to get further closer to China at a strategic level, and that would push this whole thing towards the worst case scenario that Professor Markey was referring to, which means there will be 2 blocks in South Asia, one China, Pakistan, the other India, US, and this would not serve to strengthen peace and stability in South Asia. It will, in fact, it will have exactly the opposite effect. So I think even from US point of view, if they are really interested in peace and stability in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, they should modulate or design their policy concerning India, keeping in view also Pakistan's sensitivities, the legitimate sensitivities. Now, I think I would like to say 2 or 3 more points about US, the likely Biden administration policies towards South Asia, especially Pakistan and India. One is that I think there were unrealistic expectations in Pakistan from Biden administration that it would be very helpful on the Kashmir issue. I think this would be very, very unrealistic, considering the growing strategic partnership between between US and India, to expect that the Biden administration would exercise real, pressure or influence on India to be more forthcoming in the search for a just and peaceful settlement of the Kashmir dispute, keeping in view the aspirations of the Kashmiri people and the UN Security Council resolution. I think it would be very, very unrealistic that the Biden administration would go that far. And is that they will issue statements from time to time. I would say, with all due respect to Professor Markey, perfunctory statements calling for peaceful settlement of calling for dialogue between Pakistan and India to deal with this issue. But the latest statement emanating from the US State Department, in which Jammu and Kashmir has been characterized as a union territory, shows a mindset, shows a policy decision, a policy conclusion that US has already virtually accepted as fait accompli the illegal, internationally speaking, illegal actions taken by the Modi government on 5th of August 2019 of annexation of Jammu and Kashmir in violation of its commitments and obligations under the UN Security Council resolutions. So for the State Department virtually to legitimize those actions and by calling Jammu and Kashmir as Indian Union territories, I think was even realistic person for me, something of a surprise. I didn't think that they would have gone that far. But it should be taken into account by Pakistan's policymakers of the things that are going to come. Biden administration is going to be very, very firm on strengthening its strategic partnership with India, despite the growing sway of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism or Hindu extremism in India, despite gross violations of human rights of the minorities in India, and despite the campaign of systematic oppression by Indian forces in Jammu and Kashmir, in the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, despite all this, to which they will pay lip service from time to time by issuing statements. But in reality, I think Pakistan should not expect too much relief or support from Washington under the Biden administration on these issues. It will continue its policy of developing relationship with India steadily and both bilaterally and within the framework of Quad and within the framework of Indo-Pacific, US Indo-Pacific strategy. As far as Pakistan's relations with China are concerned, again, my feeling is, although Pakistan would be very happy if, and I think Pakistan's policymakers would in fact welcome US understanding of Pakistan's economic needs, Pakistan's need for investment from China, from US, and from other sources to overcome its economic requirements, economic problems, and economic needs. I doubt very much that, and Pakistan would therefore be very happy if US is supportive and somehow gets involved in the CPEC, and which is basically an economic project, although a massive one in terms of Chinese investment, and we envisage Chinese investment in Pakistan. But nevertheless, it is basically an economic project aimed at accelerating Pakistan's economic development and increasing economic and commercial connectivity as part of Belt and Road Initiative of China, which aims at increase Chinese investment and increase the economic connectivity in the Eurasia region. But I have my doubts, very serious doubt, that Washington under Biden administration would look at this thing in that economic context. It's more likely to look at it in a strategic context as a vehicle of expansion of China's strategic influence in South Asia and through South Asia, through Pakistan, to the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf regions. And therefore, I have my serious doubts that even if Pakistan makes a very determined effort to involve the US in terms of support and of such economic projects, because Pakistan has not closed its door to American investment or European investment or investments from other sources. But obviously we cannot force those countries to come and invest in Pakistan. And if meanwhile we get this offer of investment of about $62 billion, out of which I think $30 billion have already been invested by China and Pakistan, this is something that Pakistan is within its rights, and also in accordance with its needs is within its rights to welcome to meet its urgent economic needs. So I think this will depend mostly on America and American policymakers, and if they take a more benign assessment or view of CPEC and Pakistan's position and Pakistan's role, not only in South Asia, but also in the Persian Gulf region, in the Indian Ocean region, and they see that there are opportunities for mutual cooperation between Pakistan and US, then I think there is hope that Pakistan-US relation may still be saved. And I think the test of the policymakers of both Islamabad and Washington would lie in the management of areas of divergence, of strategic divergence, while promoting and developing areas of convergence, of possible cooperation in the fields of, for instance, terrorism, from where both countries have suffered, in the field of nuclear non-proliferation, which is in the mutually supported by Pakistan and US, arms control, human rights, peace and security, not only in Afghanistan, as I said, but also in Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean region. So there are many, and also, of course, bilateral economic, trade, investment, and cultural and technical fields. And there is a large Pakistani diaspora in the US, and it is in Pakistan's interest to have friendly relations with US, to develop them further. So I think if there is a recognition of this mutual interest in several fields, in the development of relations in several fields, the mutuality of interest in that area, we may see that despite the growing convergence of US-India strategic partnership, which is quite clear, and I think we should have no doubt about it, that there will be some, in Pakistan I mean. I think Professor Markey has also, in a way, perhaps brought it out, that this is going to be the direction of future US policies. Despite that strategic convergence between US-India, Pakistan and US still can cooperate in several areas to their mutual benefit, and the test of the capabilities or abilities of the policymakers in Islamabad and Washington would lie how they can take advantage of those opportunities where Pakistan and US can cooperate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Javed. I'll now go back to Professor Markey. Professor Markey, you said that Pakistan would have to balance between the United States and China, and that's a better scenario that you projected for future ties. But what sort of balancing do you envision from Pakistan in the context of China that would be credible for the United States as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first, let me say that I found myself agreeing with most, if not all, of what Ambassador Hussain just said, and he said it quite well, not surprisingly. His last point about how Pakistan and Pakistani policymakers need to navigate and try to find this area of space where they can continue to work effectively with the U.S. side, even as the United States tilts toward India, is evocative, and I think we all need to give that some more thought. In terms of what Pakistan can do on balancing its relations with China as a means to, again, it's a similar kind of impulse. As Pakistan rightly, I hope, takes advantage of all of the opportunities that may come from things like the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The question, and this is really, I think, on Pakistan's shoulders, is how does it do so in ways that actually leverage opportunities from the outside? Now, here's maybe a minor distinction in my views from the ambassadors. He said this is up to American policymakers to, that there's not that much Pakistan can do. I would actually put the weight on Pakistan's shoulders. And let me give you a slightly more specific example. So if Pakistan is accepting billions of dollars of investment from China, again, that's great. No downside there, as long as this is investment in critical sectors that need it and that it's being done in ways that are sustainable, that are likely to be profit-making over time, or at least not create massive debt problems. But as it does so, it should be using those advantages, say, in building power plants or roads, to also create openings for other outside international investors to take advantage of that. And what do I mean by taking advantage of that? I mean, the kind of security that is availed to Chinese operators in Pakistan, and the types of negotiated deals that have often been concluded at a bilateral level, often behind closed doors, those are not the sorts of things that have been done for other outside investors. And I'm not saying they should be. Actually, ideally, what this would do is create more opportunity for economic reform, improved governance across the board in Pakistan in ways that encourage all kinds of investment. So an opening to a range of investors, including Pakistani investors, on the foundation of infrastructure, critical infrastructure that may be financed, at least initially, with Chinese sources, Chinese technology. That creates an inclusive environment, and then it's US private sector decisions that will be an indicator as to whether this is actually appealing. Because unlike China, the United States doesn't effectively direct its major state-owned enterprises to go to countries like Pakistan. These are decisions made by private US companies on the basis of a cost-benefit calculation. Can they make money? Is the risk that they run by going to Pakistan a worthy risk? And when the answer is yes, you will see more and more of them come, not just from the United States, but from, again, from Europe, from Japan, from elsewhere. Not because the United States government tells them to, but because they see enormous opportunity. That will be the sign of Pakistan policy success. And that's not a US government decision. That's a Pakistani decision. We're not seeing that yet, but that's what we'd like to see. And that's the kind of openness when I say balancing. Use what good you get from China, yes, but also look for ways to turn that into good with others. One other quick point and an area of concern. Pakistan's infrastructure on roads and rails, power sector, ports, doesn't matter who builds it, doesn't matter if it's Chinese technology really, but Pakistan's fiber optic and telecommunication sector, if built with Chinese technologies, which seems very clearly to be the case, this can have consequences, not just for sort of who builds it to begin with and who makes any profit off that, but who controls those standards going forward and what flows through those networks in the future. And I am concerned, and this comes to sort of beliefs about political development, that if Pakistan is to have an opportunity for greater freedom of thought, greater political freedoms, then opening, not closing of those spaces is critically important. And I don't think that China shares that impulse. To the contrary, I think that China and China's government is founded on the principle of a one-party state that places no value on freedom of speech, freedom of thought, on human rights. And these are things that I would hope that Pakistan would recognize some of the downside risks that it runs by investing entirely in a Chinese-built infrastructure of telecommunications and of thought that would be, over time, would close the Pakistani mind, I think, in dangerous and unfortunate ways.
Ambassador Javed, I will come back to you on this issue of China-Pakistan relations. There is a perception in Pakistan, I would say, that the Americans are themselves pushing Pakistan into China's embrace by propping up India as a counterweight to China, and that has security implications for Pakistan as well. Pakistan cannot just close its eyes to India growing militarily while it is not doing anything. Do you think that Pakistan can, in some way, impress upon the US administration to offer a similar sort of security and economic cooperation to Pakistan? Professor Markey said that Pakistan will have to be more competitive, more economically open. But are there opportunities existing for such a cooperation right now in this atmosphere?
Well, this is a very, very thought-provoking question and not an easy question to answer. But let me try. Pakistan ideally would like to have or develop its cooperation and friendship with China, while also maintaining and developing friendship with US. That should be the goal of Pakistan's policymakers. And if US, Biden administration and the US respond to this desire in a constructive and a positive manner, there is still hope that Pakistan may be able to salvage and even develop its friendship with US. A lot will depend on how US, I'm not saying it's only responsibility of the US, but a lot will depend how far and in what manner the United States develops its strategic partnership with India. As I perhaps earlier, I'm sure I made this point, that if this effort, which from America's point of view, to some extent is perhaps legitimate, I mean, they are within their rights to build up their relations with India or any other country for their own strategic goals. But if this is done totally keeping, in disregard or total disregard of Pakistan's sensitivities, if it upsets strategic balance in South Asia, then you cannot expect that Pakistan's policymakers will just be sitting there, waiting for some kind of benign, policy, benign kind of bonanza from Washington. I think we should just forget about those eras, those years when Pakistan used to get military and economic assistance from US. That is not going to happen. And neither are you going to get any substantive support from US on the Kashmir issue. I think those two issues, those two areas should be very clear in our mind as to what is going to happen. But if Pakistan's sensitivities, nevertheless, are kept in view by Washington's policymakers, Biden administration's policymakers, obviously Pakistan also wants to have good relations with the US. And this makes sense. When America is right now, despite China's rise, America remains the most powerful country in the world economically and militarily. We have very deep interest engaged in the US in economic terms, in commercial terms, in cultural terms, in technical terms, and historically. So it makes sense for us to have good relations. We would not like to do anything which damages that relationship, unless Pakistan is forced by the United States through its own policies, pushes us deeper into China's embrace. We would like to have a balanced policy in which we have good relations, good partnership with China, and also good relations with US. As far as the point made by Professor Markey is concerned about Pakistan opening up its economic sphere for possible investors, from America, from Europe, from other countries like Japan or Australia. The question is, who had prevented these countries from investing in a big way before CPEC? China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which envisaged $62 billion worth of, or envisages 62 billion or approximately that an amount of investment over a period of 15 years from 2015 to 2030, to be more precise. Had Pakistan asked, told investors in US, Europe, or other countries and under American influence not to invest in Pakistan? Of course, you can always improve the economic climate, in Pakistan. There is a lot of room for that. We must have policies which actually on the ground welcome for investors, and we need to do a lot of work. But this is something that cannot change, realistically speaking, overnight. You cannot make even a reasonable demand or request and then expect that tomorrow Pakistan will change for the better in terms of its economic policies. Unfortunately, things will change for the better in Pakistan in terms of economic policies, in terms of its, inviting or encouraging foreign investment in Pakistan. This will change slowly, but we must move. And I take the point from Professor Markey that we must move in that direction. We must very radically transform our economic policies so that they are welcoming to foreign investors from wherever they are coming. And but to make that as a condition that you have to do this before we come, well, then you are, realistically speaking, you are telling Pakistan that don't have any expectation from Pakistan, from US or from other Western countries for large-scale investment in Pakistan. Then Pakistan will be left with no choice but to get closer even to China. So I think we have to be reasonable in our expectations, in our wishes. Ideally, Pakistan should have a welcoming investment climate which welcomes investors from all countries of the world, especially those which have the potential to, like US and Europe. And finally, one more point, Professor Markey said that US it cannot control its private sector. I think to a large extent this is true. And I agree with that. China has a different kind of system, America has a different kind of system. But as we have seen in America's dealings with Iran, it is also going too far, I think, to project as if private sector is totally independent of US policies. US policies, security policies, foreign policies, it's considered play a role also in determining how US private companies will act and function abroad. Look at the way the Chinese company Huawei has been dealt with by America. Those decisions were not taken by US private sector. Those decisions were taken by the American administration. And therefore, while I do get the point, I do take the point, I think the point is to a large extent valid. The Chinese system is different, it's more state controlled from American system, which is more privately, driven. I think we should not carry this argument too far in claiming that everything that American private sector companies do is totally free of the influence of the US government policies.
And then let's shift to Afghanistan, the other element that is influencing Pakistan-US relations. Professor Markey, you said that Pakistan cooperation in bringing peace would, to a great extent, influence how the Biden administration treats Pakistan in the future. Pakistan, you will recall, helped have this February 2020 agreement under which US forces are scheduled to withdraw from Afghanistan. Pakistan has helped in the various stages of the Doha process that started last September. Do you still have reservations about Pakistan's commitment to peace in Afghanistan?
The short answer is, of course, yes. And the reason, and I'm speaking now in terms of how I imagine those in the Biden administration perceive things. The reason there will still be some skepticism is because, of course, we have a long history now of frustration, of mutual frustration with one another, and a sense that, and again, kind of channeling how I imagine returning Biden administration, former Obama administration officials are likely to see this moment. They are going to remember, and not fondly, the very challenging era of US-Pakistan relations that they experienced when they were last in office. And they are going to see in that they're going to remember that sense that Pakistan was less helpful than they would have liked. So I think that's going to color their views. Now, this is more complicated though, because the Trump administration has, and officials within it have actually been reasonably positive to quite positive about their sense of how Pakistan has actually been helpful in promoting this more recent round of Ambassador Khalilzad-led negotiations. I don't think that, I personally haven't heard a great number of concerns about how Pakistan has managed that. In other words, I think there's been enthusiasm, cautious enthusiasm, but enthusiasm about the direction that Pakistan has taken. Now, you can step back as an American and say, okay, well, sure, Pakistan is enthusiastic about this because these negotiations are effectively going the way that Pakistan always wanted anyway. And where US interests and Pakistani interests come into greater alignment over the question of the United States will withdraw, the Taliban will have a seat at the table in terms of a future Afghanistan governing body. Where those interests come into alignment, why wouldn't Pakistan be helpful? So what we're seeing is a sense, and Pakistan's not doing this for the United States, it's doing this because US policy is in a way coming closer and closer to what Pakistan said it wanted US policy to be for a very long time. Now, the question going forward is, again, and the point I was trying to make earlier is, if over the next several months, weeks and months, the United States and Biden administration officials start to get frustrated, maybe unfairly, because they believe that the Taliban are unwilling to make any sorts of concessions. And in consultations with the Pakistanis, they get the impression that Pakistan could place more pressure or create new inducements for the Afghan Taliban to be better negotiating partners, but Pakistan is either unwilling or claims that it's unable to do so, then those kinds of frustrations will resurface. And if in the end this all breaks down, realistically, I think there's a tendency for everybody to point fingers and to say who was responsible for that failure. And politically, each side will have an incentive to point fingers, not at themselves, but at the other side. And in this case, I have concerns that the other side, from the Biden administration perspective, will be simultaneously the Taliban, the actual other side, the adversary on the battlefield, and Pakistan for not having not having done as much as the United States would have liked. I just thought that Ambassador Hussein's recent comments were really excellent on the question of opportunities for U.S. Commercial involvement in Pakistan. And I wanted to kind of follow up on that, because I think that as we go back and forth, we're actually getting closer and closer to converging views, which would be constructive. Because I agree, really at the core, what I'm suggesting is Pakistan can try to use China's investment and all of the things that are necessary to have made that investment successful to improve its overall climate for subsequent investors to follow on. So yes, it's absolutely true that historically, a decade ago, Pakistan was not closed to the idea of US investment or European investment. It's simply its climate did not make that investment easy or attractive to American private sector investors who, if it had been more attractive, they would have come. And I can tell you stories about talking with American investors who, have had contacts in Pakistan, and they would say, look, it's a high risk, not necessarily high reward situation. Why should I do that? I have other places around the world where I can invest. Why Pakistan? So now, having had this round of Chinese efforts, the goal would be to leverage that to create that powerful and positive direction in terms of investment climate. And specific examples would be, where security has been provided to Chinese investors, think about creating not just security for Chinese investment, but for international investment writ large. Think about it as if you're coming to Pakistan, you will have the Pakistani state, including its security forces, will have your back and will protect your investments. Where you've eased the way for Chinese state-owned enterprises or other Chinese corporations to do business in Pakistan with one-stop windows, service windows, to access the complicated procedures and regulations that are necessary to get work done in Pakistan's provinces. Make sure that similar procedures are available to everyone else. And make that clear to outside investors who may not even know that Pakistan is making these steps. And in doing so, you'll take advantage of what China has done and make it that much more appealing to everyone else. That's where I think real success could lie, and that's what I'm suggesting.
Mr. Javed, you have heard Professor Markey expressing his reservations about Pakistan's commitment to uh, the, the peace process in Afghanistan, or his doubts and fears that where Pakistan can stop operating. But now that United States is trying to build a regional compact, that it has invited United Nations to call a regional conference for developing a regional consensus for pushing this process forward. They have included India. That revived Pakistan's fears that going forward Pakistan could lose the significance or the salience that it has with regard to this process.
Um, uh, for durable peace in Afghanistan, there are uh, two most important conditions. One, a peace settlement among the Afghan parties, Taliban, Afghan regime, and there are other political groups and parties in Afghanistan, and we all know that. That is number one priority. Or the second one is that the regional countries and major powers should support through policies of non-interference in Afghanistan internal affairs, through maybe offers of economic investment and economic opportunities to make the economic life of the people of Afghanistan better. Some kind of an environment, a regional and global environment which encourages peace as well as the reconstruction, economic reconstruction of Afghanistan. These are the two most important things that need to happen if we are really want durable peace and stability in Afghanistan, and we want to see revival of economic activity in Afghanistan. Now, America convened this as responded yesterday. Pakistan Foreign Office spokesman has virtually welcomed that, or has at least accepted that suggestion, although there were initial reports that there may be Pakistani concerns of involving India in this whole enterprise for restoration of durable peace and stability because of our experience which India has used and supporting acts of terrorism in Pakistan. So that is our primary consideration. We do not want Afghanistan to become, or which India can use for launching acts of terrorism in Pakistan, whether it be in tribal areas in Balochistan or elsewhere. So this is our legitimate concern. But in principle, Pakistan, nevertheless, despite these concerns, has said that they can live with this proposal by America, in which in the conference of important countries like Russia, China, regional countries also like Pakistan, Iran, and India, besides of course US, can participate and reach some kind of understanding, some compact, something which would encourage the peace process in Afghanistan, and which would also prevent interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs by foreign countries, be they neighbors or be they other major powers. The decisions about Afghanistan's future ideally must be taken by the Afghan people, free of foreign interference. And also these countries that have been invited, they and others can play and should play a helpful role once peace is restored, for promoting economic activity, reconstruction in Afghanistan. So this is how we look at it. And I think that is the position taken by the Pakistan government through its statement of the Pakistan Foreign Office issued on, I think, on yesterday, on 11th of March, is very sensible, very well considered, and very, I think, in the right direction. I don't know whether I've forgotten some aspect of your question. If you repeat, I can maybe touch with that. But
Uh, that's very much clear. And Professor Markey, I would like to draw your attention to what Ambassador Javed earlier said, that the State Department under Anthony Blinken has been referring Kashmir to as India's Kashmir and more lately as a Union Territory of Kashmir. Does this mark a movement towards accepting the annexation of Kashmir, which Pakistan considers as illegal?
Great. Okay. I wasn't able to unmute myself. I think that the United States is walking very careful, or attempting, and needs to walk a very careful line on this issue. But I agree with the ambassador that almost none of the considerations within the Biden administration on Kashmir are being made with Pakistan's perspective in mind. In other words, the United States does have competing concerns with the strategic rationale of not wishing to rock the boat with India being its top priority, but simultaneously a genuine commitment and concern about issues relating to human rights and democracy, including in Kashmir. And so how to square this circle has actually been a problem in US-India relations, not just on what's happened over the past couple of years in Kashmir, but was historically a challenge as well. And is increasingly problematic as we've all seen India be downgraded, judging the quality of its democratic practices, have found, like Freedom House, have found that India is less free and less democratic now than it was even 5 or 7 years ago. And the Biden administration, I think, is concerned about that and wants to do something about it. Ambassador Hussain said that probably this would only result in perfunctory statements, and that's probably true certainly at a public level. I agree with him 100%. I would not expect Washington to carry Pakistan's diplomatic water on Kashmir. Certainly not because it wishes to curry favor with Pakistan, but beyond that, because it doesn't perceive that the public criticism of India is actually likely to have any benefit. It will have only negative consequences, at least in terms of the US-India bilateral relationship. And I think it's judged in Washington as unlikely to change India's policies anyway. So far more likely will be probably, I would imagine, a sort of a two-front or two-pronged US approach on Kashmir and on broader issues of inclusion and democratic liberal practices in India. On the first hand, on the one prong will be a quiet, behind-the-scenes conversations with Indian leaders, possibly up to and including Prime Minister Modi, about the downside costs of India heading in the direction that it is heading in terms of the way that it governs its own people, and the risks that it runs over the short, medium, and long term in its relationship with the United States, which has so much potential, so much strategic rationale behind it from an American perspective, and yet will be slowed, limited, constrained if India continues to head down a path that makes it into something other than a fully democratic state. And so that's a difficult conversation, but one that I imagine US policymakers will have with their Indian counterparts, but again, behind closed doors. And then the other side of the conversation, the other prong, will come in the multilateral setting. As the Biden administration has suggested, it wants to convene a democracy summit of some sort. And there, the question will be how it structures such an event and what the aims or aspirations of that type of the diplomatic initiative actually are. And here I imagine that the aims initially will be to be inclusive and to encourage participants in such an event to think about how they might commit to reinforcing, re-energizing, and developing, consolidating their own democratic practices at home, to making their own kind of unilateral pledges of various types. And there would be a strong desire to include India among many other countries in such an event, and for India to have an opportunity to commit to it publicly. You know, I don't have enormous aspirations for that, but I think that it's a reasonable way to go. None of this will bring quick changes on Kashmir, and again, there too, I'm in. I think my views converge more or less with Ambassador Hussein's. But I think there is a genuine, actually within the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, there is a kind of a conundrum that the policymakers face, and that's real because they are actually committed. It's just they're weighing these different priorities as they go forward. I would also say I don't think that officially the U.S. has fundamentally changed its stance on Kashmir, but in a practical sense, it is more or less accepting what India has done as a fait accompli.
So, Professor Markey, I'll follow up with another question on another very important issue for the relationship. Should we be expecting nuclear talks between Pakistan and the United States at some stage, similar to the ones that took place in the second tenure of President Obama?
I guess the short answer would be I don't anticipate that any priority would be placed on that initiative early in a Biden administration. I think that the lesson that was learned from any attempt to engage on the nuclear issue with Pakistan was that we were further apart on might be. I think the US side came in with the hope that it might be able to offer a reasonable roadmap for what at the time some outside analysts called kind of normalizing Pakistan's nuclear capability in the international context. And that Pakistan might in fact respond with a kind of an enthusiastic, if somewhat still skeptical reaction, diplomatic reaction to that. What actually seemed to happen, at least from my point of view, is the United States tentatively put forward some feelers on this, and Pakistan rejected them pretty quickly, feeling that they were unfair and that they were actually motivated by something other than what I believe the U.S. Effort was actually motivated by. You know, it's always possible these things could be raised again, but with so many other issues on the Biden administration's agenda, I don't expect this will be at the top. I will say, though, again, reinforcing something that Ambassador Hussein said earlier, it is absolutely the case that as the United States navigates its competition with China in South Asia, it must be also very, very sensitive and aware of the potential that that has to create new instability between India and Pakistan, and to play into a very dangerous dynamic between India and Pakistan, including on nuclear issues, whether that includes arms racing and building out nuclear programs that would be very costly and potentially quite dangerous, or simply crisis management and managing the sorts of crises we've seen over the past couple of years. These are urgent and immediate priorities. This is a part of the world where nuclear war is possible, and American leaders need to know that and appreciate that. I think they do. And they need to weigh that against this broader long-term strategic competition with China and recognize that taking steps with India that would make war with Pakistan in the near term more likely is counterproductive. It's even counterproductive to the US effort to compete with China. And so I have argued elsewhere, including in a book that I wrote recently, that the key to successful US competition with China is not to see the whole world as an empty stage upon which we compete with another superpower, but to appreciate the interests and aspirations of the various actors in that space and to attempt to work closely with them, and in doing so, make it so that we have more friends and partners and even allies in our broader strategic competition with China. That's the key to success over the long term for the United States. And that has a resonance, I think, in places like Pakistan, which still have an interest in at least a good, solid relationship with the United States, and don't want to simply become a proxy or a part of a greater Chinese sphere of influence.
Thank you, Professor Markey and Ambassador Javed Hussain. Your insightful comments must have helped the researchers at Islamabad Policy Institute understand the dynamics of Pakistan-United relations better, and the American approach towards South Asia and this broader region in a better way. And we hope that IPA will continue to organize such events in future, which will contribute to the better comprehension of the situation. Thank you very much, everybody.